Republican officers abuse a black man, humiliate him, tie him up, and leave him in the woods. But the next morning, they find out who he really is. Subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're watching from. The night was still and cold, the kind of evening where silence wrapped the world in an eerie calm. The moon hung low over the horizon, casting pale light over the lonely stretch of highway that wound through a dense forest of towering pines. The two-lane road was cracked and uneven, showing its age with every bump and pothole. It was a route few dared to take after sunset, known for its isolation and occasional trouble. Patrol car hash. 82 cruised along this desolate road, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Inside sat Sergeant Dave Hanks and Patrolman Tom Rivers. Hanks, the senior officer, lounged in the driver's seat, one hand on the wheel, and the other adjusting his mega cap. A signature piece he wore with pride. His partner, Rivers, sat beside him, his baton spinning lazily in his hand, matching the smug smirk plastered across his face. Both men were in their element. Boredom made them restless, and their restlessness often led to trouble. "You ever wonder why we even bother patrolling out here?" Rivers asked, his voice thick with disdain. "Ain't nothing but trees and deer." Hanks chuckled, his gaze fixed on the road. "Because sometimes you find something interesting, like last week with that kid who thought he could drive drunk through my county. People think they can do whatever they want out here. Not on my watch." Rivers grinned. "You mean you just wanted to teach him a lesson?" Hanks tapped the brim of his red cap, a gesture that Rivers recognized as his way of saying he was in charge. "Damn right. And sometimes people need reminders about who's in charge." As the words left his mouth, a sleek black SUV appeared in the distance, its taillights glowing faintly against the dark road. Hanks's eyes lit up. "Speaking of reminders, look at that. What's a car like that doing out here at this hour?" Rivers leaned forward, squinting. "Fancy ride for these parts. Looks like trouble to me." Hanks grinned, already reaching for the switch to activate the patrol car's lights. "Let's go find out." The flashing red and blue lights pierced the darkness as the patrol car sped up, closing the distance to the SUV. The vehicle slowed and obediently pulled to the side of the road. Hanks brought the car to a stop just behind it, killed the engine, and stepped out with an air of authority. The SUV's driver's side window lowered, revealing a man in his early 50s. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his posture straight, even while seated. He wore a crisp, tailored suit, and his salt and pepper hair was neatly combed. His face was calm, his dark eyes scanning the approaching officer with measured detachment. Hanks leaned down, resting an elbow on the window frame. "Evening. Know why I pulled you over?" The man's voice was deep and even, unshaken by the hostility dripping from Hanks's tone. "I don't, officer. Care to explain?" Hanks's grin widened, revealing teeth that glinted in the dim light. "You tell me, driving a fancy car like this on a road like that seems a little out of place?" The man met his gaze without flinching. "I didn't realize the type of car I drive was against the law." Rivers, who had been circling the SUV like a predator, stepped forward. "What my partner means is we don't get many people like you out here. Mind if we take a look around?" "I'd prefer you didn't," the man replied firmly. "But if you have cause, go ahead." Hanks leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a mock-friendly tone. "See, that's the thing. You don't get to decide. Step out of the car for me, would you?" The man hesitated, but ultimately unbuckled his seatbelt and opened the door. He emerged with the same calm composure, towering slightly over Hanks. His presence, though understated, carried an undeniable authority, something Hanks immediately resented. "What's your name, friend?" Hanks asked, circling him like a wolf. "And what brings you out here so late?" "Jonathan Carter," the man replied. "Just passing through." "Passing through?" Rivers echoed, crouching to peer into the SUV's interior. "In a suit like that? You look more like you're running from something." Carter's jaw tightened, but he didn't take the bait. "I'm not. If you'd like, I can provide my ID. Yeah, hand it over, Hank snapped, already pulling at the man's jacket, as if searching for hidden weapons. Carter handed over his wallet without resistance, though his expression hardened. Hanks flipped through it, pulling out a veteran's ID. He whistled low. Well, well, we've got ourselves a hero here. Served your country, huh? I did, Carter replied, his voice steady, and I'm proud of it. Rivers laughed, pulling a duffel bag from the back seat of the SUV and dumping its contents on the ground. No, looks like he's got money to burn, too. Fancy stuff for a guy who's just passing through. Carter remained silent, his eyes narrowing as he watched them rifle through his belongings. Hank stepped closer, standing toe to toe with him. You know what I think? I think you're hiding something. And I think we're going to find out what it is. Before Carter could respond, Hanks grabbed his arm and twisted it behind his back. Rivers moved in to zip-tie his wrists, tightening the plastic until it bit into his skin. They forced him to his knees, ignoring his protests. You have no reason to do this, Carter said, his voice rising slightly. Hank smirked, pulling a roll of duct tape from the patrol car and tearing off a strip. I don't need a reason. Welcome to my county. As they taped his mouth shut and tied his ankles together, the forest grew eerily quiet. Carter's breathing remained steady, his eyes fixed on Hank's, with an intensity that made the sergeant hesitate for a split second. But Hanks quickly shook it off, tossing Carter into the trunk of the patrol car with a thud. Let's take him for a little ride, Hank said, slamming the trunk shut. Rivers chuckled nervously. But neither of them noticed the quiet determination in Carter's gaze. Before the darkness enveloped him, the patrol car roared to life, leaving behind the scattered contents of Carter's bag and the SUV abandoned on the side of the road. As they drove off, the first faint tendrils of dawn began to creep over the horizon. The world outside the patrol car was dark and unforgiving, the only light coming from the occasional flicker of the patrol car's rear lights as it jolted along the uneven road. Inside the cramped and suffocating trunk, Jonathan Carter lay bound, his wrists aching from the tight plastic restraints digging into his skin. His mouth, sealed shut with duct tape, left him unable to voice the simmering anger that churned within. The cool metal beneath him vibrated with each pothole the car hit, jarring his body in sharp bursts. Outside, the two officers shared a laugh as they navigated the rough terrain. Hanks, his MAGA cap now tilted back on his head, seemed especially pleased with himself. Think he's comfortable back there? Rivers asked, a trace of nervousness creeping into his voice. Hank scoffed. Comfortable? Hell no. That's the point. Guys like him need to learn their place. The car hit another bump, sending Carter's body slamming into the trunk's side. Hanks chuckled, glancing at Rivers. You hear that? Our hero back there must be getting the VIP treatment. Rivers offered a weak smile, shifting uneasily in his seat. Yeah, sure. But you think this is, maybe too much? I mean, what if he what? Hanks cut him off sharply. What's he gonna do? Complain to someone? Nobody cares about guys like him, especially not out here. Rivers fell silent, his fingers drumming nervously on his baton. He didn't have the courage to challenge Hanks outright, and so he let the uneasy feeling gnaw at him in silence. The patrol car continued its journey down the deserted road, the headlights illuminating the jagged path ahead. Hanks made a point to swerve toward the roughest patches of road, his grin widening with each jolt that rocked the vehicle. Inside the trunk, Carter focused on steadying his breathing. Panic would do him no good here, nor would anger. Instead, he let his mind drift to the lessons instilled in him during his military service. Stay calm, observe, adapt. He silently flexed his fingers, testing the restraints around his wrists. They were tight, but not impossible to deal with. At least, not yet. Another sharp turn sent his body slamming against the trunk wall, and this time he winced, the pain shooting up his shoulder. He bit down on the frustration welling within him, refusing to let these men break his composure. The car eventually slowed to a stop, its tires crunching against gravel. The night was quieter here, the sounds of the forest more pronounced. The trunk opened suddenly, and cold air rushed in, stinging Carter's skin. Hanks stood above him, silhouetted against the faint glow of the patrol car's brake lights. "Well, look who's still in one piece," Hanks jeered, reaching down and grabbing Carter by the collar of his suit. He yanked him roughly out of the trunk, letting him collapse onto the hard ground. "Not so tough now, are you?" Rivers lingered near the car, his gaze darting nervously between Carter and Hanks. "Maybe we should just leave him here and call it a night," he suggested hesitantly. Hanks shot him a glare. "What's the rush, Tom? We're just getting started." He pulled Carter to his feet and shoved him toward a rusted metal post, likely a remnant of an old road marker. The post stood crookedly at the edge of the gravel clearing, surrounded by weeds and the faint scent of damp earth. Hanks pushed Carter against the post, his breath hot and foul as he leaned in close. "You see, here's the thing about people like you," Hanks began, his voice dripping with venom. "You walk around acting like you're untouchable, like you're better than us. But out here, you're nothing." He nodded to Rivers, who reluctantly approached with a length of frayed rope he'd pulled from the trunk. Together, they secured Carter to the post, the rough fibers biting into his suit jacket and digging into his skin. "Nice and snug," Hank said with a grin, stepping back to admire their handiwork. "Don't want our VIP going anywhere." Rivers looked uncomfortable, his hands fidgeting as he stepped back toward the car. "All right, we've made our point. Let's just go." Hanks ignored him, pulling Carter's red tie loose and tossing it to the ground. He leaned in close, tilting Carter's face upward so their eyes met. "You're lucky we're in a good mood tonight," Hanks whispered. "Otherwise, this would end a lot worse for you." Carter's eyes burned with quiet defiance, but he remained still, his breathing controlled. He refused to give Hanks the satisfaction of a reaction. Hanks smirked, stepping back and pulling his phone from his pocket. He snapped a few photos, the flash momentarily illuminating Carter's face. "Gotta remember this moment," Hanks said, showing the pictures to Rivers. "For posterity?" Rivers looked at the photos briefly, his discomfort growing. "All right, Dave, seriously, let's get out of here." "Fine," Hanks relented, tucking his phone away. He turned back to Carter, his smirk widening. "We'll be seeing you around, hero." With that, the two officers climbed back into the patrol car, leaving Carter bound and gagged against the post. The engine roared to life, and the car disappeared down the gravel road, its taillights fading into the darkness. Carter stood silently against the post, his body aching and his mind racing. He flexed his fingers again, testing the ropes. They were tight but not unbreakable. He focused on his breathing, slowing his heart rate and regaining his composure. He would get through to this. He had no choice. The sound of the patrol car's engine faded completely, leaving him alone in the cold night. The forest pressed in around him, the rustling leaves and distant calls of nocturnal animals, his only companions. He shifted his weight slightly, feeling the ropes begin to loosen just enough to offer hope. After what felt like hours, the faint hum of another engine reached his ears. A pair of headlights emerged from the distance, growing brighter as the vehicle approached. Carter straightened as much as he could, his body tensing with both relief and caution. The vehicle, a battered old pickup truck, pulled to a stop a few yards away. The driver stepped out, a wiry older man in a flannel jacket and worn work boots. He squinted at Carter, his expression a mix of confusion and concern. "Well, what in tarnation is this?" the man muttered, approaching cautiously. Carter met his gaze, his voice muffled by the tape over his mouth. The man quickly realized the situation and set to work, pulling a pocket knife from his jacket. "Whoever did this to you ought to be ashamed of themselves," the man said, as he cut through the ropes. Within moments, Carter was free. He stumbled slightly, catching himself against the post as blood rushed back into his hands and feet. "Thank you," Carter said hoarsely, pulling the tape from his mouth. "You have no idea how much I appreciate this." The man gave him a long, curious look. "You all right, son? You look like you've been through hell." "I'll manage," Carter replied, straightening his jacket, "but I need to get back to town. There are some people I need to speak with." The man nodded, gesturing toward his truck. "Hop in. This road's no place to be stranded." As they drove back toward civilization, Carter stared out the window, his mind already calculating his next move. He wouldn't let this night define him, but he also wouldn't let it go unanswered. By the time they reached the edge of town, the first light of dawn was breaking over the horizon. Carter stepped out of the truck, thanking the man once more, before disappearing into the shadows of the city. The sun rose slowly over the small, sleepy town, its light spilling across the brick facade of the local police precinct. The town was just beginning to stir, and the morning carried a deceptive calm that masked the storm brewing within its walls. Inside the precinct, the air buzzed with a peculiar mix of anticipation and unease. Officers shuffled between desks, clutching steaming cups of coffee, their conversations hushed as they exchanged nervous glances. For Sergeant Dave Hanks and Patrolman Tom Rivers, it was just another morning, or so they thought. They strolled into the break room together, laughing over the events of the previous night. Hanks, ever the braggart, recounted their lesson with gusto, while Rivers nodded along, though his enthusiasm was noticeably muted. "You should have seen the look on his face," Hanks said, slapping Rivers on the back as he grabbed a donut from the counter. "All tied up like that, thinking he could mouth off to us. Bet he's halfway to the next county by now." Rivers forced a laugh, his gaze darting to the doorway, as if expecting someone to walk in and overhear. "Yeah, sure showed him." Hank smirked, adjusting his MAGA cap. "Damn right we did. Nobody messes with us, especially not some big-shot wannabe in a fancy car." The door to the break room swung open, and the chatter inside the precinct fell abruptly silent. Standing in the doorway was Captain Michaels, a stern figure whose mere presence commanded attention. His expression was unreadable, but the tension in his posture spoke volumes. "Sergeant Hanks, Patrolman Rivers," he said, his voice steady but cold. "Conference room, now." Hanks frowned, the smug grin slipping from his face. "What's this about, Cap?" "You'll find out soon enough," Michaels replied, turning on his heel and walking away without another word. Hanks and Rivers exchanged puzzled looks. Rivers shifted uncomfortably, the knot in his stomach tightening. "Think it's about last night?" he whispered. Hanks waved him off. "Relax. Probably just another briefing. Let's go." The two officers made their way to the conference room, their confidence faltering slightly as they noticed the unusual amount of attention they were drawing from their colleagues. Whispers followed them down the hall, and several officers avoided eye contact altogether. When they entered the room, they were greeted by an unfamiliar sight: a man standing at the head of the long conference table, dressed sharply in a dark suit. His presence was commanding, his posture straight and unyielding. It was Jonathan Carter. Hanks froze in the doorway, his face draining of color. Rivers stopped short behind him, his mouth falling open in shock. "Morning, gentlemen," Carter said, his tone calm but edged with steel. His gaze locked onto theirs, and in that moment, any semblance of control they thought they had evaporated. "What the hell is this?" Hanks blurted, his voice faltering, despite his attempt to sound authoritative. "This," Carter replied, gesturing to the room around them, "is your reckoning." Captain Michaels stepped forward, his arms crossed over his chest. "Allow me to introduce you to our new sheriff, Jonathan Carter." The weight of those words hit Hanks and Rivers like a freight train. For a moment, the room was silent, save for the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. "You've got to be kidding me," Hanks muttered, his bravado crumbling under the intensity of Carter's stare. "I assure you, Sergeant," Carter said, stepping closer, "this is no joke." On the table in front of him lay a laptop, its screen displaying a paused video. Carter reached down and pressed play. The room filled with the unmistakable sound of the previous night. Hanks's mocking tone, Rivers's nervous laughter, the sharp clank of the trunk closing. The video was crystal clear, capturing every word, every smirk, every degrading action. Hanks's jaw tightened, his eyes darting toward Rivers, who looked as though he might collapse. Where'd you get that?" Hanks stammered. "Your own dash cam," Carter replied. "You were sloppy, didn't even bother to turn it off." Hanks clenched his fists, his mind racing for an explanation, an excuse, anything to shift the blame. "Look, we didn't mean anything by it. It was just what?" Carter interrupted, his voice rising slightly. "A joke? A lesson? You call tying a man up, shoving him in a trunk, and leaving him on the side of the road a lesson?" Rivers finally found his voice, though it was shaky at best. We didn't know. "You didn't think," Carter snapped, cutting him off. "That much is obvious. But you knew exactly what you were doing. You abused your power. You humiliated someone who posed no threat to you. And you did it because you thought you could get away with it." Hanks's bravado returned in a last-ditch effort to save face. "Look, we've been doing this job for years. We know how to handle people like him." "People like me?" Carter's voice was dangerously low now, the calm before the storm. He took another step forward, his eyes burning with controlled fury. "Let me make one thing very clear. People like me built this country. People like me fought for your right to wear that badge. And people like me will not tolerate the kind of behavior you displayed last night." The room fell silent again, the weight of Carter's words settling over them like a heavy fog. Hanks and Rivers stood motionless, their confidence shattered, their careers crumbling before their eyes. Carter turned to Captain Michaels, his tone firm and resolute. Effective immediately, these two are relieved of their duties. Their actions are a disgrace to this department, to this town, and to the badge they claim to honor. Michaels nodded. "Understood." Carter looked back at Hanks and Rivers one last time. "You're lucky I'm not pressing charges. But make no mistake, you will face consequences for what you've done. And you will never wear this badge again." Hanks opened his mouth to protest, but the words caught in his throat. Rivers simply hung his head, his face pale and drawn. "Hand over your badges," Michaels said, stepping forward. Reluctantly, the two men complied, placing their badges on the table with trembling hands. Carter watched them for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, with a curt nod, he dismissed them. "Get out." Hanks and Rivers shuffled out of the room, their heads low, their careers effectively over. The remaining officers watched them go, a mixture of relief and respect filling the air. For the first time in years, they saw a leader who wouldn't tolerate corruption or abuse. As the door closed behind them, Carter turned back to the room. His voice was steady, his gaze unwavering. "Let this be a lesson to all of you. This department will stand for integrity, for justice, and for the people we are sworn to protect. If you can't uphold those values, there's the door." The officers in the room straightened, their respect for their new sheriff evident in their postures. Carter took a deep breath, his eyes briefly landing on the MAGA cap Hanks had left behind on the table. He picked it up, turned it over in his hands, and then set it down again. The storm had passed, but its impact would be felt for a long time. And as Carter stepped out of the conference room, the precinct and the town felt a renewed sense of purpose. The future was brighter, and the path to justice was clearer than it had been in years. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more like it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. Share this video with your friends and family to spread the message, and check out our other videos for more thought-provoking stories. Together, we can keep the conversation going. See you in the next one.